Hi guys, welcome back to Pro Studio Live and welcome to the Pro Tools Authority class. This is episode 1, so today we will mostly discuss some important foundation information that you really should know before starting at Pro Tools. So we'll discuss digital audio basics and what Pro Tools is, including some limitations and supported formats of Pro Tools. We'll also talk about the Pro Tools file structure system and a lot more. And of course, we'll end today's class with some basics of starting a new session. So, before we begin, I'm going to assume that you know how to do some basic computer functions, such as starting up your computer, using a mouse, and basic file management, such as saving and renaming folders and files. We won't be covering gear outside of Pro Tools. So, some things that we won't cover here include microphone techniques, other audio gear and monitoring equipment, signal flow and mixing boards, and how to use specific MIDI devices. But luckily for you, our other videos on Pro Studio Live cover this sort of content. So just make sure you check out our archives, which are at prostudiolive.com/archives. Okay, so let's get started. First, I want you to know the basics of digital audio, MIDI, notation, mixing, and post-production in relation to Pro Tools. So, digital audio is composed of a collection of samples. Pro Tools 11 can handle up to 32-bit floating point and 192 kilohertz sampling rate. And in Pro Tools, you can cut, copy, paste, or otherwise edit and adjust your audio, which includes drawing on the waveform and quantizing audio. If you're not familiar with quantizing, it's used to edit the rhythm of your audio, but we'll go more onto that later. So moving on to MIDI. MIDI, while audio is sample-based, MIDI records performance event data, so rather than audio samples. And just like with audio, you can edit this within Pro Tools, and you can have up to 512 MIDI tracks in Pro Tools 11. As far as notation goes, you can go inside the MIDI editor window, which is under Window MIDI Editor, which I can just show you guys right here. So you go to Window at the top, and then you find MIDI Editor. And see, I have a MIDI track in my session here. So it shows us the notes because I have it in notation display right now. Or you can go up to this button on the top left corner and you can hit that and it'll move it back into what's usually the default setting. And you can see the same notes here represented on a piano roll. So see the notes over here on the left, and then these are your actual notes in time, and time is on the x-axis. So that's basically the MIDI editor, but we'll go into more detail on that later. So in this notation display, you can see MIDI and instrument track stuff on a staff with notes represented. So there's also the score editor window, which I can show you really quickly here in Pro Tools. So you go to the window at the top, and then you select score editor, which is right below the MIDI editor. And see here, it pops up my same MIDI track. And if I had more, they would pop up here as well. But it translates all your notes that you entered into the piano roll into actual notes in a score. So we'll go into more details on how to use that later, but it's an option that you have. And so the score editor translates things like MIDI data into traditional music notation, basically. So let's move on to some mixing concepts. Pro Tools has a lot of added functionality for mixing. So there's automation, routing, effects, panning, and so on. And that stuff all saves and can be recalled within your session. So you can work with just the software on your laptop, or you can get a range of interfaces and hardware to expand the actual power of your Pro Tools-based system. Pro Tools is also very popular with post-production. So Avid has made it really easy to import video files. The supported formats are QuickTime or Avid video files, and you can import those into your Pro Tools session alongside your audio. I worked in post-production for a while, working on commercials for some of the biggest companies in the world, and Pro Tools is the software that all the post-production studios use as well. So it's not just the music industry that uses Pro Tools. And just a tiny bit of history for you on Pro Tools. It was first introduced in the 90s by a company called DigiDesign, and it has since been evolving since the 90s. And DigiDesign has been absorbed by Avid. by now. So with the eventual release of Pro Tools 9 in 2010, Avid actually made Pro Tools compatible with third-party interfaces for the first time. A lot of people thought it was about time, but they made it much easier to customize the right Pro Tools setup for you. So by Pro Tools 11, Avid had completed the goal of turning the software into a 64-bit native application, making it more stable and powerful. And just so you know, some other improvements to Pro Tools 11 include you can do 64 levels of undo, which is done with Apple Z. I'm sure a lot of you guys know that shortcut. They've made improvements to sends, inserts, metering, and mixing options, and workspace browser improvements. You can also do multiple bounces at once from many output and bus paths at the same time, which is great if you're doing something like stems, which we'll go into later. And you can do faster than real-time bounces. That was one of the big ones that people were really excited about because a lot of other software already had that. And so it's a great feature that they now have in Pro Tools 11. So you can install Pro Tools 11 and Pro Tools 10 on the same computer, actually. So I can show you. I actually have that here. If I can find my mouse. There it is. All right, so here I have the Pro Tools 10 icon, and then I have the Pro Tools 11 icon. So they took the number out for 11, but they're both installed on my computer, so I can use either one. Okay, so moving on. Digital audio has been steadily improving since it was first introduced. And Pro Tools, being a software, is obviously digital audio. So there are some important terms and factors to know before discussing and using this digital audio within Pro Tools. So I'm just going to go over a few of the basics of audio and digital audio. So sound is created by compressions and rarefactions in the air. So when a speaker plays or a guitar string is plucked, they move back and forth. And this back and forth action actually causes rarefactions or decreased air pressure when the speaker or string is moving backwards away, and it causes compressions, which is also increased air pressure is another way to say it. So compressed air when the speaker or string is moving forwards. So digital audio, it basically represents these compressions and rarefactions in the form of samples. So samples have an intensity and lie either in the positive or negative section of our waveform graphs, which brings us to waveforms, right? So waveforms, we can graph out sound using waveforms. So if you've ever seen an illustration of a sound wave, then you've probably seen an approximation of a waveform. So the waveform graph is simply a way to display the compressions and rarefactions of audio with the intensity and whether it's a compression or rarefaction on the y-axis and time represented on the x-axis. So I'm just going to pull a picture of a sine wave up on my computer here. It's a small image, but I'll kind of make it bigger for you. So here you can see the y-axis and the x-axis, and you can see the wavelength, which we'll get into in a minute here, depicted. So once you've recorded audio in Pro Tools, you can zoom in on the digital waveform to see and actually manipulate it. And it'll look pretty similar to the sine wave. It won't be as perfect looking. It'll be more jagged. But you can actually see that waveform and manipulate it. So that brings us to frequency. Frequency of sound is correlated to the pitch that we perceive. So it's measured in cycles per second, which is represented a lot of times with CPS. And it's a lot more commonly called hertz. And the abbreviation for hertz is a capital H, lowercase z, with kilohertz being a unit that you'll hear frequently, and that's just 1,000 hertz. So that would be a lowercase k, capital H, lowercase z. So one cycle is one complete vibration of the sound source. So you can also think of it as when the waveform completes one cycle. So, for example, if we're looking at the sine wave, then we can measure one cycle by looking at the distance from one peak to the next. So I like to think of it as how much distance you'd have to go on the sine wave to make one complete circle or cycle. So here you can see the wavelength on the sine wave is from one peak to the next, Or if you try to imagine this as a circle, if you flipped this around and flipped this around, it would make a complete cycle or circle. One thing to keep in mind is that audio is rarely perfect like a sine wave. So we have to get used to looking at more rough and jagged cycles than this perfect sine wave. So anyway, frequency correlates with what we hear as pitch. And generally we hear a higher pitch when the frequency increases. We hear a lower pitch when the frequency decreases. So this principle ties into a lot of acoustic theory, but we'll have to cover that in another course. So amplitude's probably the next thing we should cover. And just like frequency correlates with pitch, amplitude correlates with perceived loudness of the audio. So it's measured in decibels, which is abbreviated with a lowercase d, uppercase B. And 0 decibels, or dB, is the point where humans can start to hear. It's like a theoretical point. It's not exact. But 120 dB is that roughly the pain threshold. So that's where you'd start feeling pain from how loud something actually is. So one thing to note is that decibels are a logarithmic scale. So this means that when we double the actual sound pressure, we get a 3 dB increase on the scale, not a doubling of the dB value. However, our human ears also don't hear the doubling of the actual sound pressure as a doubling of loudness. So it takes much more than 3 decibel increase for us to perceive a doubling of audio loudness. So actually 10 decibels is about what's generally agreed upon as a doubling of perceived loudness. Okay, so analog audio is an important thing for you to know too before we start Pro Tools. And it comes from the word analogous because it's an alternating electronic current that's analogous to the original audio. So the thing to know is that you have analog audio and then you have digital audio, but Pro Tools is digital. So in order to get the audio information into Pro Tools, you have to translate that electronic signal that is analog into a digital signal, which is made of ones and zeros, which is otherwise known as binary, right? So this translation is called A to D conversion, which stands for analog to digital. And it's usually written capital A / D conversion, right? So when we're talking about digital audio, we have the sample rate, right? So sampling is when you take snapshots of the audio over and over again very quickly. So the computer then stores those snapshots in order to recall them in order to play back the audio. If you're familiar with film, you can think of samples with audio as similar to the individual photographs that are played in a series to make a moving picture or film. With film, they have to play the pictures fast enough or your eye will notice that you're seeing a series of still pictures and not a moving picture. If you've ever looked at the actual film from a movie, you can see those still pictures in series, right? So similarly, with audio, if the sampling rate is too slow, then you will hear significant disturbances in the audio. So sampling rate is basically how often these samples are taken. And an important thing to know about is the Nyquist theorem. And that basically says that if you want to correctly represent a frequency, then you have to sample each cycle of the sound at least twice. So that returns to what we were looking at with the wavelength and the cycle of the wavelength, right? Or the cycle corresponding to the wavelength, really. So if you don't sample each cycle of the sound at least twice, the computer won't be able to recreate the frequencies correctly. And this will create what's called alias tones. And alias tones are incorrect tones created by this type of frequency distortion. So that's why most sampling rates are above 40 kilohertz. Because the range of human hearing, roughly speaking, it's pretty rough, is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So in order to sample the higher frequencies twice, we have to sample at twice the rate of those cycles. So if you doubled the upper range of human hearing, which is 20 kilohertz, you get 40 kilohertz. So that's why CDs are typically 44.1 kilohertz. You'll hear people say 44.1. And you'll see pro recording at 44.1 kilohertz, 48 kilohertz, 96 kilohertz, and so on. In fact, sampling rate is actually a setting that we will select when we first start our Pro Tools session. And actually, so is bit depth. So the most important thing to remember is that bit depth affects the dynamics of your audio when you're thinking about bit depth. So dynamic markings in music tell you whether to play something loudly or quietly, right? So this returns to our discussion of amplitude and decibels. When translating to digital, each sample goes through a quantization, where each sample is quantified or assigned to its closest amplitude value that the computer has. So the bit depth, or binary word length, if you're a computer nerd, dictates how many possible amplitude values there are within that system. So the higher the bit depth, the more dynamic range we have, but the more data space is used to store your audio. So you'll have to have more hard drive space. A good rule of thumb is to multiply the word size by 6, and that will give you roughly the range for a fixed point system. Floating point is completely different, but let's just talk about a fixed point for now. We'll get into that more later. So an 8-bit system gives you roughly 48 decibel dynamic range, which isn't very much, right? But a 16-bit system gives you 96 decibels dynamic range, and a 24-bit system will give you about 144 decibels dynamic range. And if you remember that decibels are logarithmic, that's a huge increase with each bit depth increase. So those are basically the basics of digital audio. Just remember, if you're setting up a system, there's information lost whenever you do a conversion from analog to digital and back. So try to keep the number of times that you do that to a minimum, if possible, to avoid distortion. Also, if you're transferring digital audio between machines, most gear will either have an SPDIF with an RCA jack, which I can actually show you right here. So we have a photo of some RCA ends, just in case you're not sure about what those look like. So you have either that, or it'll have an AES BEU, which has XLR jacks, which again, I can show you a picture that I put together for one of my blog posts. So here on the left, you can see XLR cables, just the ends for them. All right, so you'll have either the SPDIF or the AES-BEU, and they can both be used for digital transfers. They're almost identical in terms of quality, but since the SPDIF started as a consumer format and AES-BEU started as a professional format, I'd probably recommend using the AES-BEU, the one with the XLR jacks, if possible, because it just makes you look more professional. Okay, so some Pro Tools basics. Pro Tools is an audio editing software, right? It's the most common audio editing software for music and post-production work. You'll see it in almost every pro studio. You can use Pro Tools to edit audio, which includes composition and tracking, MIDI and notation, mixing, mastering, and even post-production and other audio editing that involves video, right? As long as the video is in QuickTime or Avid video format. So Avid says that Pro Tools is a multi-track, software-based digital recording and editing system. It uses a hard disk audio recording, and it has graphical audio editing and MIDI sequencing and digital signal processing, which is often represented by capital DSP. And it lets you mix, and it's all in one system. So before we go into a bit about Pro Tools, I want to touch upon the Windows versus Mac argument. So Pro Tools works on both Windows and Mac, but a lot of people are proponents of only using Pro Tools on Mac, and most pro studios use Macs exclusively. So one of the big advantages that I've heard, and I've just heard this from teachers that I've had, is that behind using an Apple machine, the advantage behind using an Apple machine is that they keep their sources for their computer components constant within each computer model, regardless of price. Whereas Windows machines tend to select whatever sources for their components are cheapest at the time. So when you say one model of an Apple computer will work with Pro Tools, with a specific Pro Tools version, you know that the components are constant in that model, so all versions of that computer model should work too. Whereas when you say one Windows machine works with Pro Tools, since the components won't necessarily be constant with all computers of that model or that OS, you can't say 100% that all versions of that computer model will work the same with the software. So this is why some people will report that they've had more issues getting Pro Tools to work properly on Windows. But from my experience, it's easy to get Pro Tools up and running on a Windows machine. I have a Windows machine at home that I have Pro Tools on, and I have my Mac laptop, and it's reliable in Windows too. So Pro Tools 11, let's go into some configurations. So Pro Tools 11 supports 3 main types of configurations that work on Mac or Windows. And when I say work on Mac or Windows, they actually technically mean like Windows 7 or 8 is what it's approved for, and then the Mountain Lion, Mac OS X, and then I'm sure above that, I have above that on my computer and it works fine. But that's what it's approved for. So the software install is the same on all of these. With easy compatibility from one system to the next. So if you have the same third-party plugins from one system to another, you should be able to easily transfer a session from one machine to another, even if they have a different type of system, Mac or PC, HD or not, and so on. So with Pro Tools 11 authorization, you can also install and run HD hardware with or without the accompanying software, sorry. So you can easily unplug your laptop and just go. But anyway, the 3 main types of configurations that you should know about are Pro Tools software, Pro Tools HD software with HD native hardware, and Pro Tools HD software with HDX hardware. So the main difference between these 3 is in the hardware. So let's just go over a bit on hardware. A basic Pro Tools software system uses the processing power of your computer, which is called the host computer for the software. So this is where you get the term host-based, right? So having a host-based system essentially means that the software is drawing processing power from the host computer. With this type of system, you'll generally just have a hardware interface that offers inputs and outputs to Pro Tools. So some examples of that type of hardware include an 11 rack, an M-Box, even like the Digi 03, 02s, which have actually been discontinued, but I really liked those. Those were cool. But those are all host-based. So a system with Pro Tools HD software and HD native hardware is also host-based, but the difference is that it uses the Pro Tools HD native PCIe cards. And so that's capital P, capital C, capital I, and then lowercase e. Or it uses a Pro Tools HD native Thunderbolt interface to connect up to 4 HD series interfaces. So this gives a host-based, which is also called a native system, right, a bit of a boost, which allows for more inputs and outputs. Now, a system with Pro Tools HD software and HDX hardware gives you even more of a boost. This type of system uses at least one HDX PCIe card to link up to 12 HD series interfaces. You can potentially get more inputs and outputs with this setup than either of the other 2. And it also includes DSP power specifically dedicated to mixing and real-time processing. So once you have your configuration figured out, it's important to know some facts about Pro Tools. So Pro Tools 11, it supports up to 192 kilohertz sampling, right? Which is well above what we see most engineers even using in professional studios nowadays. Up to 32-bit floating point bit depth, which is well above the bit depth necessary for the dynamic range that's considered to be the dynamic range of music and speech, right? And that dynamic range is 40 to 105 decibels, I believe. So it also gives you up to 512 MIDI tracks at the same time, which I've never hit that number. And it gives you 96 simultaneous mono or stereo audio tracks with up to 128 voiceable tracks. So you also get up to 32 channels of inputs and outputs in your system, depending on your interface and peripherals. And as far as hardware is concerned, with HD native hardware, you get up to 64 channels of inputs and outputs. And with HDX hardware, you get up to 192 channels. And inputs and outputs are often abbreviated with a capital I/O. So if you see that, it means inputs and outputs. So there's 192 channels in the HDX hardware, means you get up to 768 simultaneous audio tracks and up to 512 simultaneous MIDI tracks. So HDX hardware is the most robust and superior technology as far as Pro Tools rigs are concerned. So some interfaces commonly used with Pro Tools. I'm just going to kind of mention some so you guys know about them. You can Google them. You can check it out. So the MBox family, which are basically beginner interfaces with a few inputs and outputs. I used to have one of those in school. It was great. An 11 rack, which is a guitar-focused interface with built-in effects processing, and it supports up to 24 bits and 96 kilohertz. And the discontinued Digio 3. Which I really like that one. I don't know why they got rid of it. Anyway, but it supports up to 24-bit and 96K. It has 4 mic preamps with 8 on the rack version and 8 analog inputs. And I actually used to use this one to record the Eastern Connecticut Symphony Orchestra. So I would call it like a prosumer level of gear. So some common HD interfaces and gear include the HD Omni, the HD I/O, and the HD MADI. And so I would just kind of Google those, check them out, be aware of them, especially if you're going to be working in a pro studio at some point. Okay, so Pro Tools also comes with some stock software, so to speak, like stock software, right? With plugins and virtual instruments that are included in your Pro Tools authorization. So make sure you take advantage of those. Install them, make sure you have them running. But we'll get into more detail on those later. The next thing I want to cover are modifier keys, just so you're aware that they exist. So when you're using Pro Tools professionally, knowing your modifier keys is like so important because it can really speed up your workflow, which both impresses your clients and it ensures that you don't waste their time. And modifier keys are commonly used in conjunction with other keys or the mouse, right, to execute a command or task in Pro Tools. So that's basically what they do. So some common modifiers that you'll see are in a Mac, you'll see Command. In Windows, Control is the equivalent, right? There's Option or Alt, so it's Mac or Windows, right? Control or the Start key. Return is equivalent to the Enter key in Windows, and the non-numeric keypad Delete, right, is equivalent to the Backspace in Windows. So besides those keys, we'll go into what each of those do later. But there are some other ways that Mac and Windows systems are different, stuff like file naming conventions. But you'll pretty much become accustomed with whatever system you're using. And just let me know if you have questions about if I do one thing on a Mac and you're on a Windows, if you want to know how to do it and you're having trouble figuring it out, just let me know. So I like to go into Pro Tools file structure next. So the actual session file has a .ptx extension, unless you're using older versions of Pro Tools. So versions like 7 through 9 are .ptf, I believe, and then even older extensions are like .pts or .pt5. I've seen .ptf before and PTX now. So for audio files, the most supported audio files are .wav, which is WAV files, right? And then .aif are AIFF files. And when naming a Pro Tools session, it's good to know that you can't use the forward or backslash. You can't use the colon, the asterisks, the question marks, quotation marks, apostrophes, the less than or the greater than symbols, or the vertical line symbol. So just avoid those when you're naming your session. Okay. So now that we've laid out some of the basic groundwork that we need before even looking at Pro Tools, it's time to look at some details of a Pro Tools session, right? So each recording project that you create in Pro Tools is called a session. So just like Microsoft Word projects are called documents, Pro Tools projects are called sessions. So, unlike Microsoft Word, though, our sessions aren't stored as one single file. So Pro Tools instead creates a folder which houses all of the components of your session. And this is called the session folder, right? And so within it is a session file that works to piece together all the other session components. And I'm just going to kind of show you a session folder that I have for this demo. So I have the Pro Tools Authority test, right? So this is my actual session folder. And then if I click on it, within it, I can see all these different files. They're all part of my Pro Tools session. They're all more or less necessary. I'll go over that in a minute, but it's not just one file. Okay. So when you move it, you want to move this main session folder. You don't want to move just the .ptx of your session, or you won't have a lot of stuff. So anyway, so we have the session folder, and then we have this .ptx, right, which is the session file. So what the session file does is it works to piece together all the other session components. So the session folder also includes subfolders, right, for different categories of files, which you can see here. Avid reports that they use this type of file structure to make it easier to back up sessions and transfer from one Pro Tools system to another. So that's why, I guess. So some files within your session folder include your session file, right, which we talked about. It has the .ptx extension. Used to have the .ptf. This is the file that you click to open your session, and it's arguably like the most important one to know. So when you create a new session and give it a name in Pro Tools, it will automatically name the session file and the session folder with the same name. So if you notice here, when I named this session, I called it Pro Tools Authority Test 1. So my folder, my session folder, is named that as well, and so is my .ptx file, and that's just automatically done. I didn't have to name them separately. So the session file keeps track of all the audio and video files with links from specific locations in your actual session to the associated audio file. So it's really important. It maps out your tracks, your inputs and outputs, your edits, which means that you can save and close a session and reopen it easily because Pro Tools remembers all your edits and settings. It's pretty amazing. I'm sure it's way more amazing for people that started out with total analog consoles. Because they had to physically recall that stuff, and that can take a long time. So you can also save multiple versions of a session within your session folder, which means you can create many different versions of your session. So I could easily save multiple mixes of a session to show a client, or I can make a few different saves at key points in my mixing process so that I can easily backtrack if I want. All this can be done without changing the original audio, so I don't have to worry about making an edit in one session that will interfere with the mix in another session. Okay, so next I'm going to go over the wave cache file. So this file, you can see it right here in my session, wavecache.wfm. It lives within the session folder too, right? And it has that extension, and that's how you can spot it. And its job is to store the data associated with actually displaying the waveform, so the session can quickly open. So you want it to be included in your transfer of your session if you're moving a session from one place to another, but it's just to make the session open quickly. Most engineers will never click on it or open it. Anyway, it can actually be deleted without messing up your session. The only thing that will happen is that your session will open slower because Pro Tools will have to recalculate all that waveform data. Actually, if you want to get really technical here, Pro Tools also stores another wave cache file in your system drive, which is in the Avid databases folder. At least on a Mac, I think. And the wave cache file keeps all of the waveform data for everything in your system. It's kind of like a master wave cache file. I don't know if it's technically called that, but that's kind of what I call it in my head. So those are the two file types that exist in the main session folder, but there are also these subfolders. So some of the subfolders that you'll see are session file backups, audio files, plugin settings, video files, bounced files, clip groups, and rendered files. So I'm going to just kind of go through those really quickly. So your session file backups which we see right here in my session. There's an auto backup function that you can enable in Pro Tools, and I highly recommend doing so. You can access it by going to Setup, Preferences, and your Operation tab. Let's see if I can grab that really quick. So if you go Setup, and then you hit Preferences, and then you go to Operation, it's one of the settings in there, right? So let's look for it really quickly. Let's see. Okay, enable session file auto backup. So I have it checked. It keeps my 10 most recent backups. I can change that if I want. I can have it back up more often or less often than the 5 minutes that I have here. And the default is actually for that to be on, so you shouldn't really have to worry about it too much, but I recommend making sure it's on because it can save your butt. So this folder is where those automatically generated backups will be stored. Let me just pull open that folder again for you guys. So the session file backups, right? Okay, so the audio files folder is where Pro Tools copies the audio files that you import into your session. And it's also where audio that you record within your session is saved. If you ever copy your session over to another computer or system, you want to make sure you copy this folder, because otherwise you won't have all of that audio within your session and you won't be able to do much at all. So honestly, I recommend copying the whole session folder, right? Which again is that top level folder that houses all your session information. For me, it's this Pro Tools Authority test folder, right? Yeah, so that's what the audio files folder is. So anyway, WAV is the default file type for the audio files folder, usually because of its compatibility with Windows and Mac. So AFF is also supported. So let's move on to the plugin settings folder, which I don't actually have in this one yet because I haven't opened any plugins. But this folder will appear in the same place as these other folders here. Yeah, I don't have it. So this is where settings for your plugins are stored. It's just good to know that it's there, I guess. Another folder that we have is the video files folder. So when you import a video into Pro Tools, it doesn't copy the video into this folder by default. I'm not sure why they do that, but there are specific operations in Pro Tools that involve copying a video from source media that will make Pro Tools create this folder. But if you're importing a video, I recommend creating this folder yourself and copying the video over yourself, just to be safe. So that way you don't have to worry about whether you have your video while moving your session later, right? Because it would just stink to be working on something with a video and move your session and then not have the video in there at all, right? Okay, so bounced files. So this folder is where bounced files will go when you use the bounce to disk command in Pro Tools. So I probably don't, oh, I do have one. Okay, I do have one right now. So basically, Pro Tools creates it when you open your session, but then it deletes it when you close the session if you haven't used the bounce to disk command yet. I don't remember using the bounce to disk command in this session, but that's how it's supposed to work. This folder is the default location for bounced files, but you don't have to bounce files out to this folder. But we'll go into more detail on that when we get to bouncing files later on. So the next one would be clip groups, which you can see right here. I have it, clip groups. And this folder is where clip groups go if you export them from Pro Tools. So it's similar to the bounced files folder. Pro Tools will create it when you open your session, but then deletes the folder when you close the session if you haven't exported any clip groups. So in theory, when I close the session, it should disappear because I don't think I've exported any clip groups. So just keep in mind that clip groups you make in your session need to be exported in order to show up in this folder. Just because you create a clip group doesn't mean it's going to go to the folder. And we'll get into making clip groups later. Okay, so a rendered files folder is another folder that you can get. And just like with the bounced files and clip groups folders, Pro Tools will create a rendered files folder within your session folder only if you use Elastic Audio Processing. So it won't create this folder if you don't use rendered Elastic Audio Processing. So the difference here is that Pro Tools creates this folder only for the temporary files for the audio on the tracks that you're processing. So this means that the folder only holds the temporary files that are still editable. Because they're currently in Elastic Audio mode, right? So once you commit this rendered Elastic Audio Processing to a track, Pro Tools will create a new file that is then put in the audio files folder, and it will delete the temporary file that lives in the rendered files folder. And we'll have a whole section on Elastic Audio later. So don't worry, we'll go into that. So on a side note, there are files that aren't necessarily in your session folder, but that are a part of Pro Tools that you should know about. So MIDI files, we went over what MIDI is earlier, right? So MIDI files have a .mid extension, but in Pro Tools, these are stored within your session. So you won't see MIDI files outside your session document or your .ptx file, right? So if you say you want your .mid files, like let's say you want to send just the MIDI to someone, then you can export your MIDI files within your session. So this is in the export MIDI option. So I can just show you that really quickly. Let's see. So we're going to go, I have this window open. We're going to go File, Export, MIDI. And that would be how you get to that screen. And we'll go over that in more detail later. Okay, so another type of file is Sibelius files. So Sibelius is a great music notation software. It's a separate piece of software from Pro Tools, made by different people, right? Sibelius claims that they're the best-selling music notation software in the world, and it's a pretty great software. You can write and edit notation, you can listen back to what you've written, and you can print or scan scores with Sibelius. So Sibelius files have a .sib extension, but similar to MIDI, these exist within your session, within that .ptx file, until you export them. So you can export a score that you're working on in the Pro Tools score editor using export Sibelius, right? So just like we did with MIDI. We're going to go to File. We're going to go Export Sibelius. And it's not highlighted right now, but that's where it lives, right? And you can also use a send to Sibelius command, which we'll go into later. But, and then let's see, and I covered earlier, if you go to Window and then Score Editor, you can get to that score, right? Okay. So now that you know to click on the session file to open it and what all the other things in your session folder are, you're ready to learn how to start up a Pro Tools system, right? So starting an audio system isn't always as simple as just turning on a computer. So if you have like a laptop and headphones and the Pro Tools software, you can simply turn on your laptop and open Pro Tools. But if you have hardware and an interface and studio monitors, turning on that system is a completely different matter. So it varies slightly depending on the system you have, but a general idea of how to turn off your system is you first want to make sure everything's off, right? Because if the guy before you didn't shut down properly, it can really mess you up while you're turning everything on. Then you want to turn on external hard drives that don't rely on the computer for power. So they'll have their own power cable running to a power outlet. And then you want to just wait a few seconds for them to get going. It's a good idea to kind of just wait a few seconds between each step to let things get going. So then what you're going to do is you're going to turn on your MIDI devices, which includes like MIDI sync gear, right? And then wait a few seconds for them to get going. And then as long as your audio interface doesn't rely on the computer for power, so for example, the MBox does rely on the computer for power, then you're going to turn on your audio interface next. And then you just wait a few seconds for that to get going. And then you turn on your computer. And finally, the most important thing to remember is to always turn on your monitoring system, which would be your speakers or your studio monitors, right? You want to turn those on last. Okay. So if there's one thing you remember, it's to turn on those speakers last. If you do that step out of order, you can have a nasty, damaging pop sound that's sent through the speakers when the other gear powers on. And the other gear starts to send that power through to the speakers, and it makes it's a bad noise. It's not good for the speakers. You don't want to do it. So similarly, when you're turning off the system, just turn everything off in the reverse order. And again, it's arguably the most important thing to remember to turn those speakers off first. Okay, so the only other thing that you need to know before starting up Pro Tools is what an iLok is. So the Pro Tools software and a lot of third-party plugins are actually protected from theft by an iLok system, and it's spelled lowercase I and then capital L-O-K. Okay, so the iLok is basically a USB dongle that holds the licenses that authenticate the software. I can actually show you one that I have here if it reaches. So I have this iLok right here. This is what it looks like. It's beautiful, shiny, new, kind of new. I don't know. So it's just a USB dongle that holds the licenses to authenticate your software. It authenticates that you have a legit version of the software, you've not stolen it. The old iLoks were actually blue and they were shaped differently, but this is what the new ones look like. You'll need this new version if you're going to use Pro Tools 11, so make sure you don't get one of those old blue ones, right? You can store up to 500 licenses on an iLok, so you can conceivably hold all your plugin licenses on one iLok, and Avid kind of touts the fact that you can do that, but actually some plugins allow you to authenticate your computer instead of placing the authentication on the iLok. And there are also some plugins that require a completely different type of USB authentication dongle, such as Nexus. That's the one I have, which requires a Steinberg USB e-licenser, which I actually have here too. I can show you that. It's the one that's right behind the iLok. And it's just this purple-ish looking one. It works the same way. You plug it in, it confirms that your software is legit, and you're good to go. But it's just a different format or something. I'm not sure of the details. But anyway, the benefit of installing your licenses on an iLok or e-licenser instead of on your computer is that if you're traveling between studios, you can just bring that USB licenser back and forth to have access to all your plugins, because you can find easy access to the install files for most of the plugins online. And as long as you're allowed to install those on the computer where you're going, you can then just have the plugin on your USB licenser to have legal access to them. You just have to plug it into the computer and it confirms that the software is legit. You just have to make sure that you have that software installed on the computer to begin with. So that way you can go between like 2 or 3 or more computers, bringing your iLok, and only have to buy one license for the plugins that you use on all 3. So that's pretty cool. All right, so I guess now is the moment that you've probably all been waiting for. We're going to actually launch Pro Tools and show you how to do that properly. So I'm going to quit Pro Tools here so I can launch it again. I'm going to save that. That looks like fun. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down and find this icon for Pro Tools 11 on my dock, right? And I'm just going to click it. And you can see it has the startup dialog. It's recognizing that all my plugins are there and that they're working. So the way I recommend doing it is by starting up the Pro Tools application and then opening your session like I just did, right? So you can technically just click on your session file to open up Pro Tools and then open up the session, but I was taught not to do that. And I've never personally run into this, but I heard that it's because if you try to open straight from the session without booting up Pro Tools first, that it can cause the system to like bug out a bit, and then you'll have to try again. So if you want to do it like the kosher way, right, you just open the application first. And if you're on a Windows system, Pro Tools 11 is generally installed on, I think it's C, and then Program Files, and then Avid, and then Pro Tools. And then within that folder, it'll be like ProTools.exe, because in Windows it's .exe, right? But it also generally installs a shortcut on your desktop, so you can click on that shortcut, or you can probably find it under the Start menu. Or if you're on a Mac, you can find Pro Tools 11 in the Applications folder. Or if you're like me and you might want to add Pro Tools to your dock, you just right-click on the dock and you can go to Options and select the Add to Dock option, which I think we can see the reverse here. So I right-clicked and then I did Options, and it says Keep in Dock, right? So yeah. So that's what you want to do. Yeah, I think you can also just drag the icon onto the dock from the Applications folder. Then it will always be there for you to easily open it. So as you can see here, I have the Pro Tools 10 and Pro Tools 11 icons because I have a co-install of both Pro Tools 10 and 11. Okay, so once you start Pro Tools, it will either open up the Quick Start dialog or simply open up Pro Tools without the dialog. That's kind of a settings thing. I think the default is the Quick Start dialog. So here you can see the Quick Start dialog. Basically, once Pro Tools is open, you can change some settings, some of which involve restarting Pro Tools to take effect before you even open your session. So if I want to not use the Quick Start dialog, I can just go to like Setup here and let's say Playback Engine, and I can actually just switch this. So it's on what I want it to be on right now is Pro Tools Aggregate, but there's like a few other options here, right? And sometimes my computer defaults to this, which is a third-party software. So I like to make sure that it's on Pro Tools Aggregate if I'm just using my laptop. And then you can hit OK. So you can mess with these settings before you even open up a session. So let's see. We'll go into the details of more of that later, right? But before you get started, if you're using a host-based system, you'll want to make sure your system's settings are optimized for that. So if you remember from earlier, we have host-based, which means that you aren't using any DSP cards and are instead using only the computer's processing power, right? Which is what I'm doing here. So native Pro Tools systems are host-based, right? So non-native systems use the HDX cards, which use DSP chips. And they're specifically for processing audio, but sometimes these systems will use host-based processing for things like native plugins. But anyway, those DSP chips give you a lot of added processing power. So there are a couple of settings that you can tweak to improve or change your system's performance. One is dynamic plugin processing, and the other is the hardware buffer size, which is usually written capital H/W. So if you go to Setup and then Playback Engine, which I'll do right here. I'm going to set up Playback Engine. That's where I just was, right? You can see this hardware buffer size, right? And you can see dynamic plugin processing down here. So, yeah. So the dynamic plugin processing is actually new to Pro Tools 11. If enabled, Pro Tools will, according to Avid, it will maximize plugin counts by dynamically reallocating host-based processing resources as needed during playback and recording. And that's like a mouthful, right? But what that basically means is that under certain circumstances, it lets the Pro Tools audio engine take some plugins offline, which saves you on CPU usage, right? So because of this, it's recommended that you keep this option enabled, which I have here. It's clicked, so it's enabled. So the next setting is the hardware buffer size, right? So first of all, Pro Tools 11 has two types of plugin processing. There's high latency and low latency. The high latency processing always remains at a fixed high buffer size, right? So it's always fixed. It's always a high buffer size. The low latency processing has a user-defined hardware buffer size, right? And that's what we can set to optimize performance. So, of course, this setting doesn't affect DSP processing, just native processing, right? This buffer size setting controls the size of an actual cache, CACHE, that type of cache that's used for host-based processing. So, for example, like native plugins, right? And it's while monitoring live input or during recording. So what a lower hardware buffer size does is it reduces monitoring latency. So while monitoring live input or during recording, of course. And a higher hardware buffer size gives you more processing power for tracks while you're monitoring live input or during recording. But you get more latency. So basically the takeaway with buffer size, to boil it down for you, is that you want to set it low while recording to reduce latency. And it used to be wise to then switch it to a higher buffer size setting while mixing, which would increase the processing power of the plugins, right? But with Pro Tools 11, it automatically uses a higher buffer size setting for mix tracks. So they say that you won't have to switch it manually as much anymore. So again, these two settings are under the setup and playback engine, right? So here we have it open, setup, and then open playback engine. And you should just check those out. Make sure you understand them before you start your session, before you start working. So now you're all set to create a session. So again, we want to have opened the Pro Tools software either through the applications folder or on the dock. And once we've done that, we can either use the quick start dialog to create a new session, either a blank one or from a template. You can also open a recent session or open any session on the computer. The open session option basically just opens up a file browser to find your session. I'll show you that in a minute. Or we can also cancel out the quick start dialog, which is what I just did. And it will be as if Pro Tools was already open on the computer, or as if the quick start dialog option is not enabled. So I'm just going to get out of this playback engine and see I have the Pro Tools with all the menus up here at the top. So basically, when you create a new session in the quick start dialog box, let's see, I'll just close that again to restart it so we can see that quick start dialog box. But when you create a new session in the quick start dialog box, you'll notice that there's the session parameters dialog that you can click on it to open up some more options, right? So I'm just going to do that really quick, right? So I'm going to go to create a blank session. And right here you see session parameters, and you can open that up. And I believe that, yeah, it's their first session from template as well. And we'll talk about templates more later. But so in these session parameters, you can see some of the parameters that we discussed earlier, right? Like sampling rate, bit depth, and the audio file type. So now you know about those things. Now you can select those things. I usually recommend like 24 or 32-bit. The WAV files are good. Let's see. Sampling rate, you're pretty safe. I mean, a lot of people will record at higher sampling rates because it's supposed to give you increased quality. I've heard comparisons back side to side, and you can hear the increased quality, but a lot of people won't notice the difference. Anyway, okay, so you can also create a new session and then select these same parameters if you cancel out of the dialog box, right? So we have this right here, the quick start dialog box. I'm going to cancel out, and what I can do is I can go file, new session, and it'll have the same exact parameters you see here. So if the dialog box doesn't open for whatever reason, you're still fine. So if Pro Tools is already open, or you don't have the dialog box, you can just go to file and then new session, and you can see the same exact options. You can do the same things like create blank session from template and create blank session, which is what I just did here. And you'll also notice that if you go to the file drop-down menu, that you can select open recent or open session, which I'll show you right here. Oops. So we have open recent and open session. And that's just like in the quick start dialog box. So that's about all we have time for today, but I'm just going to quickly create a new session here so you can see an open session in Pro Tools and how it populates the folders that we talked about and we saw earlier. So I'm just going to go new session. I'm just going to let all those settings be as they are. I'm just going to do a test, and I'm going to put it on the desktop so we can see it appear over here. And so here we are in the session. If we look at the desktop, here's my test folder. You can see all those folders were created automatically. And yeah, so my blank session, here it is. It's open. You can see that we have a mix window and an edit window. So if you look at the top here, let's see my computers. Okay, so you have mix window here, and then I'm hitting command and then the equals key to switch between the two. There's the edit window here, and we'll go into these more in the next episode, but you can see they're just one behind another. It's not like when I'm switching with the short keys, it kind of looks like magic a little bit, but they're just behind each other. It just swaps their order. So we'll go over those two windows in the next episode. Now that we've done some good groundwork on the basics of digital audio and Pro Tools, we can get into all of the details of Pro Tools in our next episode. So in episode two, we'll be going over the different menus in Pro Tools, the different windows, tools, modes, some customization options, and so much more. So I hope to see you guys next time.